Okay. So Josh Kurlantzick is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of several books, the most recent one that he'll talk about today on Beijing's global media offensive, China's uneven campaign to influence Asia and the world. Josh was previously a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he studied Southeast Asian politics and economics and China's relations with Southeast Asia, including Chinese investment, aid, and diplomacy. He's previously been a fellow at the University of Southern California at their Center on Public Diplomacy and a fellow at the Pacific Council on International Policy. He's currently focused on China's relations with Southeast Asia and China's approach to soft and sharp power. And I think we'll hear a lot about that today. He's also working on issues related to the rise of global populism in Asia, and the impact of COVID-19 on illiberal populism and political freedoms overall. So it's my great pleasure to turn this over to you, Josh.
Thanks so much, and thanks to Pace for having me. I hope we will have a lively discussion. I'm not really a big lecturer. I'm not at CFR, we usually don't talk in our events for more than 20 minutes and then just have a discussion and Q&A. So I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief so people have time to talk, ask questions, etc. This, just for a brief background, this book was kind of a follow-up in a way to a book I wrote that came out in 2007 called Charm Offensive. At that time, I looked at China's soft power in a number of places, including Southeast Asia and other regions. And at that time, China was, while becoming more powerful, still a long way from where it is today economically, militarily, and strategically, and was actually quite successful at that time in many aspects of its soft power, in part because it was able to present itself as kind of a benign actor in a lot of regions and differentiate itself from the United States and to some extent other major regional powers like Japan, etc. At that time, China presented itself as an actor that didn't interfere in other countries' affairs, that supported any country's model of development, and they had quite a effective and sustained campaign of soft power, including cultural diplomacy and other aspects. So I wanted to come back and look at the work on this book actually began in 2017, although the book goes up as far as possible to the present day. My editors let me open the book up again before, when it was actually almost done, and get stuff in like the Ukraine war and China's supporters for that, which has certainly been horrendous for China's global public image, as well as they allowed me to get in zero COVID, which also has not been great for China's global soft power or image, as well as definitely not great for China, some other aspects of China's domestic situation. And they even let me get in right before the book was published some aspects of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and some of the ramifications. So the book is as current as it could possibly be. So I wanted to look at what happened now that China is the second most powerful country in the world. It's a dominant economic power. It's the most powerful economic actor in East Asia. It's the most important trading partner in East Asia. It has the second most powerful military in the world. It's much, much, much more assertive diplomatically, some would say over assertive in a whole wide range of regions. And so I wanted to look at, now that China is essentially a global power, and in fact, in many ways, a very assertive global power, how they were planning to wield both soft power, which means efforts to sort of improve a country's favorability with other countries, and sharp power, which is kind of a more covert, coercive effort to wield power sort of behind the scenes through tools like paying politicians on the down low, wielding power surreptitiously at universities and in student groups and other tools like that. And what I found is that, and so the overall tenor of the book is looking at China's expanding efforts to influence the domestic politics and societies of countries around the world through a variety of tools. And what I found is that China has had, despite the fairly hawkish, actually I would say extremely hawkish debate about China now that has in the US, particularly in the executive and legislative branches, that China's actually only had a mixed record actually in its efforts to wield influence within other countries' politics and societies. So to wield this influence, China is using several tools. It's expanding its state media outlets, including newswire Xinhua, as well as its global television network, CGTN, and its global radio network, CRI, China Radio International. Only Xinhua among those, I think, has had much success. The others have really not had much success at all. It's expanding its social media platforms, most notably TikTok. China has used deals with local media, with Chinese language media in many countries, as well as having actual state Chinese firms make investments in Chinese language media in many countries. And that has actually led to a situation in which most of the Chinese language media everywhere from Southeast Asia to Australia to New Zealand, to the United States and Canada has really created a situation where there's almost no independent Chinese language media that covers China and their actions independently. Most of the media, virtually all of the Chinese language media in most places is now essentially pro-Beijing. China has also engaged in other influence activities, including types of economic coercion, building training programs for foreign officials and foreign journalists, dramatically stepping up its efforts to wield influence among diaspora Chinese in a whole wide range of ways. Old-fashioned type influence efforts like directly paying politicians or directly meddling in elections, as has happened in Australia and potentially in Canada in the 2019 federal elections, and to some minor extent in the 2022 midterm elections here in the US, and many other tools. This current approach reflects a huge shift in the mindset of the Chinese leadership too. It's become much more autocratic at home under Xi Jinping. China has shifted from a kind of consensus-based authoritarianism before Xi, where a group of senior leaders around the top leader made decisions and often solicited input from technocrats and other experts. Whereas now China has moved much more clearly in the direction of one-man rule, which is dangerous both for China and for the world, because you cut off sources of information in one-man rule, and you run the risk that that one man, or it could be a woman, but in this case, man, can make decisions based on very little accurate information. Xi Jinping is not yet Vladimir Putin, but we can see in Vladimir Putin someone who is in one-man rule and has made a series of catastrophic decisions based on very poor information, as well as basically scaring any experts from telling him accurate information. China's influence campaigns today reflect a huge departure from its foreign policy before Xi Jinping. It reflects a much more assertive foreign policy overall that under Xi reflects a combination of three ideas. One, among the Chinese leadership, is that it's imperiled and surrounded by hostile powers in Asia, which isn't completely wrong. The second is the notion that Beijing's time has come, that China has emerged onto the world stage and to reclaim its status as a great power, and particularly reclaim what it calls discourse power, the ability to shape global narratives. Chinese leaders and officials have been angry for years that discourse, global discourse that, comes from the media primarily about issues related to China, but just issues related to the world and many things, is dominated. The discourse is dominated. The themes are set by media outlets and social media platforms now based in liberal democracies. The New York Times, the BBC, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the Nikkei, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, etc. And China very much wants to have its own tools that it can wield this type of discourse power, both to present itself in a different way, to protect the CCP from criticism, the Chinese Communist Party, and the third aim that I get to here is, in terms of the more assertive foreign policy, is that Xi Jinping is really the first leader since Mao to promote a more ideological foreign policy, and really the first leader in China's modern era to promote the idea that China has openly promote the idea that China has a model of development that it can and should promote to other countries. That model of sort of effective one-party managerial governance, authoritarian capitalism, certainly has lifted many people out of poverty. It's been enormously successful in lifting people out of poverty, and Xi Jinping has not been shy about promoting it to other countries through speeches, through training programs for foreign officials, etc. Some of that sort of idea that China has developed very skillful managerial governance, its authoritarian capitalism is the way of the future, was been dented pretty heavily by its poor managerial governance of COVID, of its by its sort of over aggressive diplomacy towards a wide range of countries, by its support for Vladimir Putin in the war in Ukraine. And you'll see that China's, in polling by Pew and other research organizations, that China's global public image in a whole wide range of countries, including some countries that were previously quite favorable to China, like in Central and Eastern Europe, China's global image has really declined dramatically. And those countries in Central and Eastern Europe, the main factor is simply that China has stood behind Vladimir Putin, which is anathema to them. But in other places, like in Southeast Asia and other regions, countries have become more worried about China while continuing to be economically dependent on China because of China's highly assertive diplomacy and military strategy. And so you have this situation, for example, in Southeast Asia, and Australia to some extent, in which countries are, excuse me for 1 second, incredibly dependent on China, trade and economy wise. China's by far their dominant trading partner and often their investor, and yet they're terrified of China's strategic aims. So they are building up their ties with the United States and other powers. You see this in the new agreement by the Philippines to allow greater US basing there. You see this in Australia's deal with the United States and the United Kingdom to build submarines, and there are other aspects of that. You even see that in countries that historically have been quite favorable to China, like Indonesia, where they have joined new massive US-led military exercises in the Pacific. So you have China wielding greater influence, but at the same time, through its state media, through its control of Chinese language media, through its sharp power efforts, through its economic coercion, and through some of its other efforts, it's tended to scare some countries, regionally, globally, etc. And that has bounced back against China. So one of the things, the book is actually subtitled China's Uneven Efforts to Influence Asia and the World. And so one of the points that I make in the book is that despite Beijing pouring money, resources, and time into its media, information, and other types of influence, in many places, it's actually failed in its influence tactics. Its big state media, other than Xinhua, haven't gained a great audience. It has succeeded in taking over most Chinese language media in most places, but its efforts to meddle in politics has led the United States, Australia, it's coming in Canada and Europe and other liberal democracies to put into place very tough laws on foreign interference in politics, and probably tough laws on foreign investments in communications and information technology and media. So that has actually potentially backfired against China. Here in the US, there is a robust debate going on within the Biden administration, Congress, even about TikTok, which is a somewhat less political, more apolitical, somewhat less political platform of potential influence. Yet at the same time, their TikToks right now, data on TikTok is routed through servers in China. There have been notable times when TikTok censored or changed content critical of China. And the parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, has a seat on its board basically for the Chinese government, and that seat is probably the most powerful seat on its board. So there is, a real discussion going on and debate going on here, in the United States as well as in other democracies. India has already banned TikTok, for example, straight up, whether there can be some resolution to it. I mean, obviously TikTok is enormously popular. And so I think the Biden administration doesn't want to ban TikTok. They also probably don't want to anger a lot of their young voters who love TikTok. But, there is a debate going on about that. However, and I'm just going to end here since, like I said, I'm not going to talk forever. And I thought 20 minutes is a good amount of time. The fact that China has not so far had great success with some of its influence activities. They have had success with making Xinhua, the news wire, really powerful and picked up by local media all over the world, which allows China to sort of insert Xinhua, which is essentially a propaganda outlet in many ways, into the local media of many countries. That's a success. Like I said, taking over most of the Chinese language media is a success. Spreading WeChat globally, which is a super app, but there is a lot of discussion on WeChat of news, and WeChat even is heavily censored. is a success, and they've had some success with scaring universities and campuses into self-censorship about China. We could talk about that if you want. There's many examples about that, as well as putting significant and unfortunate pressure on a lot of ethnic Chinese students at universities all over the world. Not necessarily only Chinese nationals, though those are the most susceptible to that pressure, but the pressure for self-censorship even comes on ethnic Chinese students. Obviously, the idea that the Chinese government seems to think that anyone who is of Chinese extraction should somehow be loyal to the CCP. That is a long-standing belief that they've had for decades, which is, of course, obviously false. Many people in the United States who are of Chinese extraction came to the United States. They fled China because of the repression of the CCP. Many of them are not from China themselves at all. They're from Taiwan, or they're from places in Southeast Asia where there are ethnic Chinese populations. But the Chinese government has really put pressure on students, not just Chinese nationals, but ethnic Chinese students in Australia, in the United States, and Canada, and in many other countries where there are large numbers of ethnic Chinese students, to self-censor, to spy on each other in some cases. And that has created, among some ethnic Chinese groups on campus, as well as, to be fair, among some universities themselves, a climate of self-censorship about aspects related to China. Why don't I stop there? I think we maybe went 1 or 2 minutes over what I said I was going to do, and take questions.
Great, terrific. No worries. The floor was yours, as short or as long as you felt like talking. So if people want to use either the raise hand function or put questions in the chat, I think either method is fine. Can I actually start with a question which you can tell me if it's out of bounds, or if it's either outside your kind of preparedness to talk about today, and that is Chinese influence both in somewhat more conventional ways and then I would say somewhat unintentional ways. And the two examples I'm thinking of are, one, China's relationship with Myanmar, and how the relationship between China and Myanmar has really shielded the military junta, and emasculated ASEAN, if it could be emasculated more than it is. It has crippled ASEAN in terms of its response to Myanmar. And then secondly, China's surveillance strategy, their electronic surveillance strategy, and how countries in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, I think, are increasingly using some of the same strategies that you see internally in China. Do you feel comfortable maybe commenting on those two things? If we can, get your video okay?
What?
If we can get your video okay.
What happened?
You're sort of jumping around a little.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. I don't know what the heck is. Jesus.
That's all right.
What the heck?
Do you want to turn off your video for a moment, and then we can
no, just hold on. I'm really sorry about this. Okay. No.
Yes. There you are. You're good.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
No worries.
Having some technical difficulties. Okay.
Understood.
First of all, to go back to the Myanmar question, I don't think China, neutralized or neutered ASEAN's efforts on Myanmar. I think ASEAN has been a complete disaster on Myanmar, and they would have been a disaster no matter what China did, because several reasons. One, ASEAN operates by consensus, and the authoritarian states in ASEAN, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and to some extent Thailand were never going to go along with any tough measures, really tough measures against Myanmar, because they don't want to set a precedent in which the organization is interfering in their own domestic affairs. It's doing it again. Sorry. Hold on. All right. That's if it does it again, I don't know what to tell you. So I think ASEAN has been a complete and utter disaster. They have they have basically given up on doing anything organizationally. Malaysia and Indonesia have taken their own tougher positions, but I don't think China is the reason ASEAN did nothing. I think the reason ASEAN did nothing is ASEAN. Secondly, I think China is indeed providing sort of rhetorical and infrastructure and investment and aid support for Myanmar. So they are providing some degree of lifeline to the junta, although less so actually than Russia, which is providing oil that is keeping the junta alive, as well as much greater supplies of weapons than China is keeping the junta alive. That said, the situation is still fairly dire for the junta. They control maybe 20% of territory. They want to have an election this year to try to sort of create legitimacy for themselves. I don't think that that's going to get them much. Maybe it'll get them. Maybe it will get them. I'm doing my best here. Maybe it will get them. Well, you can still see me. Maybe it will get. Maybe we'll get them, a couple other countries to give them legitimacy, but I really don't think so. I'm not even sure they can hold an election, given how much of the country is controlled by anti-junta forces. Sorry, did I answer that question?
Yeah, you did. And it was interesting to me. I hadn't thought too much about Russia's impact on Myanmar. The other question that I asked was really the almost unintentional influence, which is countries in the region like Vietnam and Cambodia using really Chinese surveillance strategies, electronic surveillance strategies.
Yeah. So China has definitely created a model of sort of internet control, which they have a walled garden in essentially intranet in China, where it's very hard for where the internet in China is heavily censored and filtered. And it's very, very hard. And it's become much harder for Chinese people to access the internet outside China. There's been a huge crackdown on VPNs. VPNs can get you in jail and other remote types of access. And the penalties for accessing them for Chinese people is quite harsh. And at the same time, the internet is used as a kind of surveillance tool to monitor Chinese people. That model definitely has been exported to a number of countries. Vietnam has clearly modeled their idea of how to handle their own internet on China, as well as many of the surveillance tools, the sort of technology-enabled surveillance on China. Myanmar did too, although the junta is not really at this point capable of implementing it very widely. Thailand has implemented many aspects of it. Russia has definitely implemented huge aspects of it. Russia's internet was actually fairly free until the Ukraine war. Not free, but it was far, 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 far freer than China's. And Russia has now implemented a Chinese-style intranet/surveillance technology system, as well as China has been promoting this to a number of authoritarian African and Middle Eastern governments as well. And so there's certainly they are certainly already starting to be that model being developed in some autocratic African governments, and China has played a role in that. I expect to see more of that in places like Rwanda, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, as well as possibly Egypt. And Egypt has already started down that path, and possibly also some of the Middle Eastern, the more repressive Gulf states. So certainly that model of combination of a kind of controlled internet with little external ties to the outside. In other words, decoupling of the internet from the global internet, plus using the internet in other ways of surveillance, has definitely something that China's exported to other countries.
Great. There are a couple questions in the chat, and I guess maybe the easiest thing is just for me to share them out loud. Nico asked if you could explain a little bit more about Chinese influence in American universities. So I don't know if you want to do kind of a quick, the attempt through the Confucius Institutes and some of the other efforts.
Sure. So Confucius Institutes, for those who weren't familiar, were these things that were set up by the Chinese Ministry of Education in a whole wide range of countries all over the world. And they are designed to partner with universities, and many universities in the United States partnered with them to promote Chinese language and culture. And in theory, they were supposed to bring a lot of Chinese language teachers and others, as well as work with the universities to offer classes to broaden the university's ability to offer classes in Chinese, as well as offer some classes in other Chinese language, other aspects related to China. The concern that began to occur, and Confucius Institutes are now increasingly being shut down in the US, in Europe, and in most other liberal democracies. I expect within the next few years, there will be almost no Confucius Institutes left in the US, although there are many left in both autocratic nations and developing nations which aren't autocratic. What happened with Confucius Institutes in the US and some other liberal democracies, the concern became that there were a number of incidents documented in which the Confucius Institutes seemed to be putting pressure on faculty and students, sometimes outside of the realms of normal faculty governance, to engage in self-censorship, both in the classrooms where Confucius Institutes were the Confucius Institute's classrooms, in which there was some students complained that there was a climate of self-censorship about a wide range of issues. If you're interested in more in this, there's been extensive reporting by the National Association of Scholars, which has done a huge number of reports about the problems with Confucius Institutes. The Department of Education has also done assessments of it, as well as the Hoover Institution. And then there was a second problem in which there was concerns that Confucius Institutes, which were bringing a decent amount of money to a modest amount of money to US universities, but more importantly, they were allowing US universities to make connections in China. And so a lot of universities wanted those connections so that they could set up satellite campuses in China, which many, I don't know if Pace has it, but many big prominent US universities, Hopkins, Harvard, virtually all of the big ones have them. And those are incredibly valuable to them and also huge money makers. But there began to be a concern that in addition to a degree of self-censorship in the actual courses being offered at the Confucius Institutes, that Confucius Institutes employees and directors were weighing in on speakers being invited to campus in some cases who were critical of the CCP, and in some cases they may have managed to get those people kiboshed. And so what you have now in Congress and in the executive branch in the US right now is the most hawkish approach to China that's probably existed since the 1950s. In fact, Joe Biden's China policies are tougher than Donald Trump's. Donald Trump was certainly put into place some very tough policies, but because his policies were very scattershot and not really his China policies were not very coherent. Biden's policies, which are as tough or tougher, probably tougher, I would say, and are organized in a very coherent way around several acts passed through Congress, but and signed by Biden. Because his China policy is both tougher and more coherent, it's actually much tougher towards China than Trump's was.
So this is the next question, I think is continues that piece, which is, if the Biden administration were to ban TikTok, any guesses how US might expect China to respond?
Right now, I don't think Biden banning TikTok is the most likely scenario. I think that the most likely scenario, or that the European Union bans TikTok, or Canada bans TikTok. The most likely scenario is one in which the US comes to some, and this is being worked on in a very complex deal between the administration, the parent company of TikTok, and a US organization called CFIUS, which examines foreign investments in the US. It's a committee, government committee. Still think the most likely scenario is one in which TikTok vows to keep US users' data on servers in the US, although that then opens the door to every other country asking TikTok to do the same. So TikTok is taking a risk doing that, but I think given that so much of there's the Chinese version of TikTok that exists in China, but so much of TikTok's growth and thus revenue comes from the US and other big wealthy countries, that it's in TikTok's interest to come to some accommodation like that. So I don't necessarily think Biden, even though you may have bans like I think it's actually already happened, but Congress people and senators and executive branch officials should not have TikTok on their phones, and you may have bans where TikTok is not allowed on the phones of people in the US military. I still think they'll come to some accommodation where TikTok is allowed, but users' data is kept in the US. If they ban TikTok, I'm not sure how China will respond. I mean, it's a complex situation for China to respond, even though the Chinese government has one seat on the board. TikTok is, and ByteDance is technically primarily a private company. And Xi Jinping, in addition to all of his other issues, has been cracking down on the Chinese private sector and curtailing it, which is also a disaster because that's the main source of growth in China. So I'm not sure how they would respond. It'll be hard for Xi Jinping to come out and say, this is terrible, you're banning TikTok, while at the same time he's cracking down on the private sector. But yeah, they may say that it's racist and that it's going to allow US social media platforms to essentially copy what TikTok is doing. They're already trying to do that. But I still think at this point that they're going to come to some accommodation.
So I want to ask a question, and it's not from the chat, but it also has to do with China's use of platforms. In this case, YouTube. China's gotten very, very good at putting out kind of counter narratives, pro Beijing content. And actually, one of the students, Kyle, showed me a video today on the South China Sea and sort of the historic context for China's claims on the South China Seas. And it was very slick, right? And in English, well, English and Chinese, but unaccented English and some Chinese subtitles. Are there ways to discern, are there tells that of content on YouTube where you can say, yeah, that's Chinese state media, even though there's nothing actual, about the video that will tell you that?
Well, actually, the major social media platforms in the US vowed to label state content. So that should have already been happening on YouTube, Twitter, and the others. What's happened instead, and there's been quite good reporting about this on Twitter. There has also been good stories about it on YouTube and others, is that as the major social media platforms have laid off huge numbers of people, one of the biggest areas where they've laid off is content moderation. And so you're having a lot of state linked campaigns fall through the cracks, certainly on Twitter, but also on YouTube and other. Facebook has been better, or Meta, whatever we want to call it now. Right, but that is probably the biggest problem, that actually it is supposed to be labeled as state linked content, and therefore would give the user a notice that it was, but YouTube, and Twitter in particular are completely falling down on the job on doing that. They were doing a better job at that a year ago, but they have completely fallen down on the job. In terms of beyond that, I mean, I think things you can look for, I mean, it depends on how knowledgeable you are. If you're knowledgeable about China and the South China Sea, you can look at it and see that if it's showing that China claims the whole South China Sea, that's just outright false, and has been in a 2016 decision in The Hague by an international court shown to be false. But I don't expect, most people to be knowledgeable about the specifics of South China Sea. I mean, you can try to look at sort of the production of it. A lot of the stuff that China puts out on YouTube and other social media is not as sophisticated as Russia's. Russia is still much more sophisticated in their propaganda and disinformation on social media channels. Russia has tended, and they did this in 2016 and in 2020, and they did this in Europe as well, to have a better understanding of the sort of organic divides within societies. So Russia has did a very good job, for example, in 2016, about playing on organic divides, creating false accounts, et cetera, and playing on organic divides that already existed in the US, class divides, race divides, et cetera. China has not really gained that level of sophistication, although they are trying to do so and are learning from Russia, or they were learning from Russia before the Ukraine war, which now is taking up probably virtually all of Russia's time. Similarly, like in 2020, Russia was quite good at understanding some of the organic divides that emerged in the US over issues like racial and social justice, and using that organic understanding, using that understanding of organic divides to use false campaigns to heighten it and turn Americans against each other, as well as to just generally denigrate democracy, which as a system of functioning governance, which in 2020, remember, democracy was not functioning. The governance was not functioning super well in the United States. The COVID response was chaotic, to say the least, at first, et cetera. China also, increasingly uses its campaigns on social media platforms, not only to promote China or promote China's ideals, but also to denigrate democracy. But it has done so much less than Russia. And democracy globally has had, although it's still rough times, has had a better last couple of years, while Russia and China have not had a great last couple of years. So that goal of denigrating democracy is maybe a little bit harder for them. Don't want to go on too long.
Great. So Kyle asked a different question in the chat about possible scenarios where Beijing launches an attack on Taiwan. And then sort of a second part of that, which is, could the Chinese economy survive Western sanctions, if that was the response?
Not a military expert, so I don't want to venture too far into this. I don't think Western sanctions would be the issue here. I think an invasion of Taiwan would lead to a conflict that most people who are younger than 90 or 95 years old have no memory of. And I think that's one of the dangers. People in the United States have gotten used to, and other countries that would be involved potentially, like Australia. Japan's a little different. Japan hasn't been in a conflict, the Second World War, but people in the United States have gotten used to these conflicts, like Afghanistan and Iraq, which didn't necessarily go well, but they were primarily they were conducted by a volunteer army, which made up a very small percentage of the US population, which has problems in itself. Not to denigrate the people who fought and died there, that is the ultimate sacrifice, and they did sign up to be in the volunteer army, but for many Americans, it was sort of far away and not really part of their lives. That would be completely different. The idea that sanctions would be an issue, is a second or third order issue. An invasion of Taiwan would lead to a war between major powers for the first time since the Second World War, unless you count the Korean War, but China was not really a major power yet at that time. It would probably lead to millions of casualties. I don't know that the US public has any concept at all of the level of bloodshed that would be involved on both sides. It would lead to, I have no idea. You could have a draft, you could have, I mean, all sorts of things. So sanctions are, yeah, that's, I think, all I can say about that. In terms of, is China going to invade? If they're not going to invade, what's going to happen, etc. I'm not a military expert. China's military and the military balance is not my specialty, so I don't think I would be I don't think I have anything that's super insightful to say, although if the person who asked the question wants to email me, I'm happy to suggest some people who have written good stuff about it.
Great. So Jacob asked a speculative question relating to the demographic shifts in China, the shrinking population. But I might expand, I think, what Jacob's asking, which is, given the premise of your book, that China has launched these influence campaigns, but haven't necessarily been successful, and they are facing significant challenges at home, any sense of whether China's likely to double down on this kind of hardline wolf warrior diplomacy, or maybe taking a step back and returning to a more, charm offensive strategy?
Well, certainly China's demographic problems are disastrous. There's really no way out of it. So that's the first thing I would say. You know, even if China was to, if fertility rate was to go up to 3 or 3.5%, 3 or 3.5 children starting now, which is not going to happen, they wouldn't be able to reverse their massive demographic decline for decades. And that's not happening anyway for several reasons. One, the authoritarianism, the intense authoritarianism of the Xi Jinping era has really turned off a lot of young Chinese. Unemployment is high among university leavers. And they, as we saw with the protests, it's impossible to tell, but there's been some degree of collapse of trust in the government. So, and also because of the previous one-child policies, those same people also have to take care of their elderly parents, presuming that their elderly parents still live in China, which is generally a good bet. So the likelihood that you're going to convince a bunch of young people of childbearing age in a country where Xi Jinping is cracking down on the private sector, which is where young people wanted to work because it's innovative and more open, et cetera, where unemployment is really high among young people, where they're unclear about sort of the future direction of policy, and there's a growing some degree of lack of trust in Xi Jinping, where there's a disconnect between this very elderly, sclerotic Politburo around Xi Jinping, which is basically just yes men, as compared to past Politburos, where there were indeed people who provided real input to the top leader. And these young people also, there are retirement homes in China, but it's not a common thing. The tradition is, and just because there's a lack of social welfare. The odd thing about China is it's supposedly a communist country, but has one of the highest inequality rates in the world and basically a complete lack of social welfare. But that you're going to convince these young people, given all those factors, to suddenly decide to get married. And you don't have to get married. You could have kids without getting married. That's also not easy in China. But let's just say get married and have 3.5 kids is ludicrous. You're not going to, that's just absurd. I mean, there's a propaganda campaign to have more kids, but, and it's not consistent just with trends in any, upper middle income or rich country. South Korea is well below fertility rate, virtually every, and China essentially doesn't allow immigration. So you got that too. That doesn't mean you can't immigrate, but it's almost impossible to become a Chinese citizen. So if it's not impossible, but so there are almost no countries in the OECD, the Organization of Rich Countries, that have fertility rates at replacement. I believe the US is actually in decent shape on that, as well as Israel and maybe one or two others. But the idea that China is going to have any strategy, so the demographic decline is real, and it's going to be a time bomb for them. I do think that will lead to some backing off of their wolf warrior diplomacy. I think actually Xi Jinping said several times in the last 6 months to 8 months, he publicly said that maybe this somewhat different approach should be tried. Notably, he also appointed as foreign minister the former U.S. ambassador to Washington, who is definitely not a wolf warrior diplomat. He's an old-fashioned kind of diplomat. And and thirdly, I think there was Xi Jinping and the foreign ministry and others around Xi Jinping were looking for a meeting with Blinken and then possibly with Biden for some sort of put things back on track with some degree of rapprochement. Of course, that was now kiboshed, at least for now, by this ridiculous balloon. It's not ridiculous, by the balloon incident. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that. We don't have that much time left, but yes, I do think they're going to back off on that somewhat. Yes, the Wolf Warrior and diplomacy, and I think they were trying to do that already.
So maybe I'll ask, and this can be a one sentence answer, follow up on your balloon comment and the putting the brakes on Blinken's visit to China. There was some speculation that there's an indication of that maybe Xi Jinping isn't, kind of calling all the shots, particularly perhaps in the military. Any indication that maybe he's not firmly got his fingers in all the pies?
No. I mean, I think, there's no real indication of that right now. You're talking about criminology here a little bit, but, reporters were calling me when there were these very brave protests by people about the zero COVID policy. And some reporters were asking me, where does this go? Is this going to lead to the downfall of Xi Jinping? And I said, this is very brave. It shows that there is a higher level of dissatisfaction that I think a lot of outsiders appreciated. And I think that the protesters will continue to use what they learned from that. Their dissatisfaction will not go away. And that they've seen that they can make Xi Jinping and the government change policies. And that's a valuable lesson. But when I was talking to reporters and they were saying, well, could this lead to the downfall of Xi Jinping? I would have to ask them, first of all, there's a broader trend in which public protest over the last 10 to 15 years has resulted less and less in regime change as compared to before that. And there's been widely studied by political scientists, and that's partly because social media sort of undermines actually the ability of public protest to really gain traction. Whereas compared to like the past, like it's maybe before many of your students, this is before your students' time, but let's say like Solidarity in Poland. Solidarity was built up to fight communism and the Polish government step by step, right? It started with trade union activity and Lech Walesa, and then it built up into meetings of large numbers of organizers, underground, sometimes not underground, but basically a lot of in-person meetings, which built trust among the people who were involved in Solidarity and created, when they had protests, a high level of trust and a willingness not to back down. And social media can lead to large protests, but because it doesn't build bonds the way that type of organizing in the past did, those protests tend to sort of dissipate. Zeynep Tufekci, I hope I said that right, who's an excellent researcher, has done tons of work on this if people are interested. So just to go back to the final point, what I was going to make is reporters asking me, well, so does this mean Xi Jinping could be in trouble? And I said, you have to show me the scenario in which Xi Jinping is in trouble. So these protesters are not going to overthrow the state. I mean, the lesson learned from 1989 by the Chinese government was to put into place an enormous surveillance state that shuts down protests before they can really gather into anything significant. And most importantly, before they can gather large protests in Beijing. And so how else could Xi Jinping be toppled? Well, he could be toppled by an internal coup within the civilian apparatus, the Politburo, et cetera. But the Politburo is all his lackeys. So as compared to, say, like in Mao's era, where there was a lot of contestation in the Politburo, that's not going to happen. The third way he could be ousted would be a military coup. loses control of the military decides for whatever reason, they'd be better off with a different leader. But Xi Jinping has, at the top levels of the military, very, very strong support. And so in the terms of the ways that leaders are brought down, actual protests, which forces them to step down, very hard to imagine. Civilian disruption within the leadership and military coup, it's very hard to imagine. That doesn't mean that China won't ever change, but people have been banking on the collapse of China for a long time, and I don't see it. I mean, for the Chinese regime, I don't see it happening anytime soon. So sorry to say that.
Right. And I think on that gloomy note, we will bring our session to a close. You did generously offer, if it's okay, I can share your email if students have follow-up
Yeah, I
questions.
see there are some
else
questions here
mediate.
that students have that I wasn't able to get to. If you ask them, I will to email me. I will.
Sure.
I all of them individually.
Great. Terrific. Well, so if people could virtually join me in giving a round of applause to Mr. Kurlantzick. We're thrilled that you are healthy. I hope you stay healthy and that you were able to join us today on Zoom.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And thanks so much for having me.